Toen ik haar uitnodigde, reageerde ze per kerende post. Schoonheid en troost? Ik hoef er niet over na te denken. Ik heb slechts één associatie. Zorg dat ik een camera krijg, wat centen, en ik ga naar Australië, naar mijn zus, naar de bloemen daar, naar de Aborigine vrouwen en hun onvoorstelbaar prachtige kunst. Dat is het eerste en het enige waaraan ik denk. De camera werd geregeld en Germaine Greer reisde af. 2 weken filmde ze. Het resultaat is een home video in de letterlijke betekenis van het woord. Germaine Greer in haar geboorteland. Een home video in 3 delen. Deel 1, mijn zus. Deel 2, onze bloemen. Deel 3, de vrouwen van mijn land.
Beauty itself is not always a consolation, for it is inseparable from transitoriness. Be it the beauty of a girl, or a boy, or a flower, or a song, it must end, and soon, if it is to be perceived by earthlings as beautiful. A flower that doesn't fade is hideous. A song that runs through our mind for an hour, let alone a day or a week, bores and irritates and finally disgusts us. Beauty gives us pleasure. The keenest pleasure, if prolonged, must turn to pain. A toothache can last for a week or a month and seem only to grow sharper for its long duration. But there's no point in studying to prolong orgasm, for an orgasm prolonged for as much as an hour would have long ceased to be a pleasure. Human beings are geared for pain. Pain is what we're good at. If a thing of beauty is to be a joy forever, it's because we have the power to recall it when it is gone, drawing it into our imagination where it shines all the brighter for the surrounding shadow of bereavement. Death and annihilation are necessary conditions for the existence of beauty. Every poet who ever wrote has known that joy's hand is forever at his lips bidding adieu, as Keats said. No poet was more achingly aware of beauty than Keats, who was ill and dying all his short life. What consolation can there be for the awareness that everything we love is dying? When I sit around the campfire with my Aborigine friends, whose way of life is already hideously distorted and will soon be eclipsed, what consolation can I find? I look at the evidence of their psychological and physical ill health at the piles of discarded packaging, clothing and soiled disposable nappies, the beer cans and the rusting car bodies that disfigure their beloved landscape, and listen to the children who clamour for Coca-Cola and sweet biscuits and will not eat the fresh clams and oysters, whelks and cockles that we have gathered from the ancient metamorphosed rocks that glow red under the pale turquoise sea, and my heart aches with love for them. They are moving away from me and my way of life, as my childhood, my own youth and beauty have abandoned me, and I love them as I love the blue skies of the dreams that anchor me to youth and innocence.
Here, I think the diversity is mainly driven by the fact that life is tough, really tough. You've got Mediterranean climate, admittedly good rains most of the time in the winter. You've got very, very hot, dry summers. You've got low fertility in the soils. You've got periodic fire, and then if that's not enough, you've also got ENSO, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which means that you can have a couple of winters where you get very little rain at all. So all those extreme conditions, they drive the diversity of this particular area.
Why is the soil so old?
Well, this continent hasn't had any volcanic activity of any note for millions and millions of years.
So it's the oldest landmass?
Yeah.
By what sort of factor?
Well, if you look at most of our soils, they're derived from Silurian Devonian parent rocks, which is 300 to 400 million years old. So they're very old. And that the soils have mainly been driven from one side of the continent to the other by trade winds. So they're just not particularly fertile, and apart from throwing superphosphate all over them, there's nothing much really you can do with them.
So they've actually... I'm so stupid, I don't even know how soils are formed. Where do soils come from?
Well, soils come from parent rocks.
Being eroded and ground down and powdered.
Yeah, and with rain action.
Okay.
Folding, yeah.
Okay, so soils are, as it were, decomposed rock. So once upon a time these soils were fertile, we may suppose.
Yeah, but then this part of the world also, most of the soils are formed from marine sediments that have been uplifted, and then you've got the ranges that have also been marine rocks that have been folded and uplifted as well.
So the nutrients have leached out of the soil. I mean, how have they become so highly mineralised? That's why they're red, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's still iron deposits, which is part and parcel of the folding and the uplifting of the rocks. It's brought up magma with iron in it, and that's been recycled in the sands around here. But I wouldn't say that I'm not an expert, but I wouldn't say that the iron content is particularly high. But
here in this southwest corner, it's obviously very high in the soil.
Yeah. But but the other reason you see red soils too is that you get a higher rate of oxidation when you've got higher temperatures.
When my sister, Alida Jane Burke, and I comb through the senescent scrub, hunting out the wildflowers of Western Australia, Our passion for them is fueled by our knowledge that in the artesian water, trapped far under the red ground, the cinnamon fungus is proliferating, attacking the woody stems and rootstocks of the richest flora on Earth. Every month a species goes out of existence, some before they have even been identified. If we can only fix them in our memory, they will not be entirely lost. There's no time to draw the hundreds of species we find, so we photograph them. Now I use a digital video camera so that we have moving pictures as well as stills that will best display the structure and the habitat of each vanishing treasure. Jane insists on teaching me taxonomy, making me identify my flowers in the correct manner, proceeding from the family to the genus, to the species, to the subspecies, frustrated by my unscientific habit of leaping to a name on no better evidence than a remembered picture.
Very pretty, very subtle, I think. And this is the juvenile growth. With typical tea tree foliage, isn't it? But I love the fact that the stem is pink. There's always these extras in these plants. As if they were really trying to wow you.
Actually, that's something else.
Is it something else? Oh,
No.
oh, dear.
This is a wattle of some description.
Oh, shit. I always do
You can
that.
tell by the phyllodes, their angle to the stem.
Come on.
While I gloat over the blossoms that will soon be seen no more, she photographs the dieback caused by the cinnamon fungus
These are at least...
and the regrowth in the areas cleansed by fire.
And why do we suppose it's made itself like that? Do you know what it looks like to me? It looks as if it's burning. It's reminding you that it needs fire.
Well, usually when plants produce this red coloration, it's usually in response to stress. If you have a look at your apple tree in the middle of summer and if the leaves are starting to turn red, you're in trouble. It's also probably a sign of senescence because as you go down the plant, they get redder and redder until we get to these senescent leaves at the bottom.
Wherever we go, we find spectacular death and degradation, glittering scars on the landscape, caused by the bringing of salt to the surface, by the same rising water table that brings the deadly fungus. This is our fault. If Europeans hadn't tried to turn Australia into Europe, this would never have happened.
In Western Australia, salinity is attributed to salt-laden winds that are blown onshore. And if you add up that effect over millions and millions of years, you're going to have a fair amount of salt deposition on this particular part of the country.
So, but presumably it wasn't at toxic levels until it began to be concentrated in the soakages and.
Well, what happens is that you get small amount of salt, bit of sedimentation, small amount of salt, bit of sedimentation every year, cyclically. So the salt sits in the earth all the way through, quite evenly, and not particularly toxic levels. But when you wipe out the trees and you reduce respiration and water loss from the system, then it
the water table rises and brings the salt to the surface.
Yes.
I see. So, but there must be a higher level of salt tolerance in West Australian natives from this province than there would be in plants from elsewhere. I'm interested in mineral influences as well on speciation.
It's one thing to have salt-laden winds depositing salt on your leaves. It's another thing to have tolerance to salt levels in the soil through preferential uptake. That's another thing altogether, because that's an adaptation that they would have to be making now very quickly. Things don't happen like that.
Oh, because it's constant on the clearing of the land.
Absolutely, it's happened too fast.
What can be my consolation? My consolation is my sister, and my love for her. She is smaller than I, and more trimly built, but her gestures are my gestures, and her vivid habit of speech is mine also. Our senses of humour are the same sense of humour. She is hurt by the same kinds of injustice and insensitivity as I. Her eyes are deep grey blue, and mine are hazel, but we see the same things, and we feel the same about them. We laugh at each other's jokes, and sometimes arrive at the same joke simultaneously. I am gangling and unsteady on my feet, while she is nimble, but she waits till I catch up, and watches with concern in case I stumble. If I am hampered by my equipment, she takes it from me and carries it for me, so that my two hands are free to ward off disaster. She's the one who rings the 24-hour chemist to make sure that my bruises are drawn out by extract of leeches, so that the swelling and the pain may diminish, well knowing that I wouldn't bother. We spend a good deal of our time together naked, foraging together, as unaware of each other's bodies as non-human animals are. She gives me advice that I follow now and then. I respect her, admire her, and am furiously proud of her.
Okay. Identification, please, Dr. Greer.
Oh dear. I don't think it's in the Murtacey.
It is so in the Murtacey.
I think it's in the Rutacey.
No, it's in the Murtacey.
It smells of oranges and lemons. It does.
And it's waving its stamens at you everywhere.
Oh, I'm worried about that scent. That doesn't smell to me myrtaceous.
It's definitely myrtaceous.
All right. Well, it's not.
I must eventually lose my sister.
I see. Myrtaceous.
Indeed, I may be said to have lost her already many years ago, when I ran away from the house she lived in with my parents. I was not yet 18, and she was not yet 12. I saw her briefly 6 years later, before travelling 12,000 miles away from her to live in Europe. She married a man she must love more than she loves me, and bore him 2 sons, ditto. Our lives were as different as could be, and yet we were similar, oddly together in our difference. We almost never wrote to each other, but when we did, it was as easy as if we had talked every day. As we perched naked on rock pillars looking over the Arafura Sea, she tells me what it was like to be my kid sister. And I think how I blinded myself to her suffering when I abandoned her, knowing that if I'd looked back, I could never have gone. If I hadn't gone, I shouldn't have survived. She knows and understands, and it's okay.
Their mechanism is a little bit different to Grevillea's. Here is the corolla tube.
Don't show it on the plant.
Here's the corolla tube. Inside the corolla tube is a style with a stigma on the end that extends right up to the end of the tube, but it's adpressed to the pollen organs that will be right next to the style here. As the flower matures,
I will not lose her again until death or dementia takes one or other of us, as must happen.
But in the process,
When her 2 boys were grown, she went back to school, motivated as she is in everything she does, by love. For love of her fragile country, its shifting coasts and threatened bush and native habitats, she put herself to study botany, especially the botany of the southern coast we were born on, and the fragile alpine region, where she still snowboards with her boys who are now grown men.
The anthers are rolled back. They're probably... their function's over because they've transferred the pollen.
As a mature student, she was ignored and belittled by her teachers and her fellow students, but she hung on until they had no option but to register how gifted and hard-working she is. She embarks on all her self-imposed tasks with a single-mindedness and passion that I recognize as my own, whether she's charging through the dunes with notebook and binoculars to chart the vicissitudes endured by the sand plovers, or planting a lawn of wallaby grass to demonstrate to the local authorities how they might use a native species that is less invasive than marram or couch, or advising a tentative client on the right plants for her suburban garden. She wants to teach me to live under canvas. I want to get her to sleep under the stars. Don't think for a moment that we're not both easily exasperated. I would rather be exasperated by my sister than have an easier time with anyone else on earth. Much more exists in this world than anyone, no matter how creative, could imagine. The specialness of species is much more than anyone could deserve. Each grain of pollen is a triumph of design, each plant a citadel of vegetable architecture. Can there be planets in other solar systems as beautiful as this one? Australian plants are, like Australian animals, distinct from those growing anywhere else on Earth. Hundreds of genera, thousands of species are found only in Australia. Each species has developed in order to occupy a specific niche in a fantastically varied ecosystem. This is the southwest corner of the continent of Australia. What survives here makes it still one of the richest sources of biodiversity surviving on this abused planet.
The Kwongan is a heath community adapted to fire on low nutrient soils, and it favours low-growing, sclerophyllous, hard-leaved, fire-prone vegetation, mainly woody. There's a few forbs and herbs, a few sedges and grasses, but it is mainly low, shrubby, woody,
Myrtaceous growth.
Myrtaceous, protaceous.
Here is a small patch of Kwongan, growing alongside a railway line and a main road, almost in the shadow of a huge grain bin. On the other side of our piece of wasteland were sheep paddocks, where the native flora had been driven out first by clearing, which caused erosion and leaching of the soil, and then by the effects of cropping by the sheep, and their hard feet scuffing the fragile laterite and sandy soils of the Kwongan. The introduction of coarse grasses from South Africa completed the devastation. Yet still, on the road verge, the Kwongan and its native inhabitants struggle to stay alive. On a single morning in September, in this small patch of disturbed, abused and polluted land, we found an astonishing variety of plants in bloom. These are verticordias, commonly known as feather flowers, each more delightful than the last. The feathers are not petals, but the calyx. As in many Australian species, the petals are much reduced to save moisture loss. Here we found 3 species growing together: yellow feather flower, white feather flower. This feather flower turns red as it ages. Painted feather flower. This one carries its inflorescence in a loose spathe. Europeans are becoming familiar with bottle brushes, a name that is used for several genera in the families of Myrtaceae and Proteaceae. This one, sand bottle brush, is a Beaufortia. Beaufortias are myrtaceous. So are the callistemons and this melaleuca. But there are proteaceous bottle brushes too, calothamnuses and grevilleas. As far as flowers of the quongan are concerned, red colour and bottle brush shape is a winning combination. Why would a flower want to look like a bottle brush? Jane explains, using as her example scarlet honey myrtle.
Well, maybe it's another sclerophilic habit that a lot of petal tissue could result in moisture loss in low moisture situations. So the result is a reduction in petals. You can actually still see the petals if you look at the base of the flower.
Oh yes. So they're
just tiny reduced petals, and then the stamens around the edge of the cup, and you can see both the ends of the stamens and the stigmas presenting in the whole flower. So you're seeing a mixture.
Eucalyptus is another genus that seems to have eschewed petals, but in this case they form the cap from which the genus gets its name.
It's just another option.
What happens in the structure of blossoms like this? These are stamens, are they?
Yeah, and you can see the pinkish stigma in the middle. There's about 40 to 50 stamens. And there's the stigma in the middle. It's quite a good example, because at least they're different colours. They're often the same colour. It's very hard to distinguish the stigma. And then this is the calyptra, the little covering that falls off, and there's the stamens in the bud. And here, this is a structure that is really modified petals or a modified corolla.
Oh, so it's a fused corolla tube.
Yep.
It's actually been closed.
Yep.
And it's dehiscent. It has to be got rid of.
Yep.
Eucalypts are myrtaceous. So is this elegant leptospermum, which has also reduced its petal load to a minimum. This large proteaceous shrub is called a chitic. These are unopened corolla tubes. In these, the tubes have split to allow the long beak of the pollinating bird access to the nectaries. The mechanism is easier to demonstrate in this grevillea. The unopened flower holds the stigma folded in, next to the pollen-bearing organs in the base of the flower.
When it unfurls, it carries the pollen to the end of the style. The anthers are right down the base of the flower next to the nectaries, so that when the bird comes, attracted by the sweet material in the nectaries, puts its beak in, but its head hits the top of the stigma and picks up the pollen. The stigma at the same time is not receptive to its own pollen, it becomes receptive later.
Some of the grevilleas are familiar to Europeans, but not these one-sided ones called red toothbrushes, and certainly not this black toothbrush, or this wax grevillea. Banksias are well known too. But this rare red one with hanging flowers can be seen only in the Fitzgerald River National Park. This is one of the prostrate Banksias that send their woody branches out flat to the ground, holding the inflorescence down where the ants can find it. All such plants attract their pollinators with sweet nectar at the base of all their tubular flowers. This is the barrel cone flower.
Each one of these tiny little things is a flower.
Yeah.
And it's got fused petals with the stamen.
So it's a little trumpet-shaped flower.
Yeah. This whole structure contains hundreds of ovaries, but only a few of them are going to be finally fertilised. Although they look like they all are.
What do you call this pattern?
That's the logarithmic spiral. It pertains to all vegetation, all plants. They have that logarithmic spiral.
European nurserymen also know some members of the wax plant family, the Camelorsiums. But most of the 8,500 species that are native to this area are unfamiliar to Europeans. Some look familiar, but are in fact quite different. This native foxglove is no relation to the digitalis of Europe. It belongs to the family of the Cloanthaceae, which includes this cyanostegia or tinsel flower, with its pale blue calyx extending much further than the dark blue corolla. This is a Lachnostachys, one of a whole family of woolly-headed shrubs called lamb's wool. This one, Lachnostachys ferruginea, grows only in this area. This woolly plant is a smoke bush. So far, 36 species of this genus, Conospermum, have been named. To an eye used to the lush vegetation of Western Europe, most of this looks dead. This is because these plants are all sclerophilous or hard-leaved. Without sufficient humidity to rot it, old growth simply turns woody and gradually collapses until fire clears it out. In amongst this woody debris, you will still find spectacular clumps of blue Leschenoltia. There are 20 species of Leschenoltia in Western Australia. The commonest are blue, some are red, and this rare form has tubular flowers like a heath. The Barron's regalia grows only on quartzite rocks on the Barron's Range. All 5 members of the regalia family are found only in the southwest botanical province. This fringe lily is one of 49 species of Thyssinotus, all but 3 of them found only in Australia, most of those in the southwest. Pattersonia is a kind of iris. Its habitat is now threatened with takeover by introduced South African species of Gladiolus and Watsonia. Weird and wonderful peas. Worldwide, the family of peas, the Fabaceae, consists of about 500 genera, comprising about 12,000 species. Of these, Australia has about 140 genera, of which no fewer than 40 are endemic to the southwestern botanical province. And what's really interesting about this pea is that you've got this 3-sided packet with the beautifully veined bracts holding it, and then it pops and you get these
symmetrically arranged flowers. When the flowers have gone over, when they're finished, the bracts reclose around the seed chambers, around the ovaries. See, there they are in there, and there the bracts have closed. They look like a bougainvillea or something.
This wonderful plant is called the black coral pea. You could probably grow this in a conservatory. When this Hakea was first seen, it was named for Queen Victoria. The flowers are small and quite hidden in the axils of the flame-like leaves.
Here we see fruits 2 or 3 years old. That's a typical Hakea fruit, bivalved with a horn on the abaxial edge. Later on these will split in two and they'll show the 2 ovaries with the seeds embedded in the woody pericarp. And then in here we've got fruits that are more than a year old. They're just starting to form. And then we've got the new buds that are going to be the flowers for this year's flowering season.
The genus Hakea is endemic to Australia. About 70 of the 100 or so species occur only in Australia.
The Hakeas have bilateral splitting fruits.
Like chestnuts, like.
And they've got a little horn on the end. And they're really, really woody. I mean, some re-sprout after fire, and others are serotinous. They hold the seeds in the canopy, and the seeds are only released in response to fire.
These have popped, and they've dropped their kernel.
Yep.
And that would have been when?
During the last fire.
Hakeas, like Banksias and Grevilleas, are members of the Proteaceae. Worldwide, this family numbers 1,400 species. The more than 550 species to be found in southwest and Western Australia are found only there. Dryandras too are found only in Australia. This is a golden dryandra with one of her pollinators.
Dryandra's an Australian genus, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, all the genera in the Proteaceae in Australia are endemic to Australia. There are similar plants in the same family on other continents, but the genera are endemic to Australia because they've evolved for so long.
This proteaceous plant is called a petrophile.
But it's a little tree. I hadn't realised that. I thought it was herbaceous.
All the Proteaceae are woody, and the fruits are typically proteaceous. In fact, if you have a look, it just looks like a Banksia cone.
This midget tree grows along the ground so that its pom-poms of flowers are within easy reach of the ants who will pollinate them. The beautiful genus Darwinia too is endemic to this region. It was named for Charles Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. This is Darwinia squarosa. This is another Darwinia, Darwinia oxylepis. Pink petals are in fact bracts enclosing the small flowers. Many Australian wildflowers follow the same strategy of enclosing small and insignificant flowers within showy bracts, as this hooded lily does. The Pymelias, too, cousins to the European Daphne, present their flowers like a bouquet already wrapped in papery bracts. The most spectacular of the Pymelias is the Quaalude bell that grows on sandy, lower-lying land within sight of the barrens. Banksias are another genus that is found, except for one of the 76 species, solely in Australia. No fewer than 59 of the 76 are found in southwest and Western Australia. This handsome plant is Banksia coccinea. Its pollinator is a possum no bigger than my thumb. In these blossoms you can see the geometry of the anthers folded under until they are ready to pop out and touch the pollinator. The tiny possum, a little climbing marsupial, is now very rare. If he perishes, the scarlet banksia will perish with him. This biodiversity is probably the result of stress. Stress caused by the poverty of nutrients in the soil, its low moisture retentiveness, the hot summers, and the incessant salt-laden westerly winds. Each plant represents a triumph of adaptation to some combination of all these factors. Here, in the Pediplain of the Stirling Range, habitats vary according to the amount of sweet water runoff and soakage, and with each change in altitude. Crucial to the habitats throughout this area is periodic visitation by fire. If these king ears hadn't been burnt, they wouldn't have been able to flower. The king ear, or black gin as it used to be known, is a genus to itself. It belongs to the select family of Xanthoriaceae, 10 genera in all about 100 species, all but 4 of them found only in Australia. These black boys, too, only put up their flower spike after they've been burnt. Among the cinders we found this daisy of daisies, flannel flowers, so called because of their cottony involucral bracts. Coral peas, this nodding cone flower, cousin to the hakea and the petrophile, and trigger plants. This one, the maize trigger plant, cat's paws, kangaroo paws, and orchids, a veritable carpet of flowers. The southwestern botanical province is home to 300 species and subspecies of terrestrial orchids. This is a Thelymitra, or sun orchid, growing with hundreds of others in the rubble near an abandoned dam. Southwestern Western Australia hasn't just one species of blue orchid, but dozens. This is another Thelymitra, commonly called the leopard orchid. These are some of the large family of donkey orchids, conspicuous like donkeys for their big ears. This is the biggest of them. This pansy orchid is a member of the same genus. These are mignonette orchids. This is the cowslip orchid. This is an enamel orchid. These are some of the spider orchids. These are dragon orchids. This is a mantis orchid. These are my favourites, the trigger plants. The family of Stylidiaceae contains only 2 genera, the Leeuwenhoekias and the Stylidiums. As far as we know, there are about a plant in the world, and 135 of them are found in the southwest province. But new species, or rather what are thought to be new species, are found every day. The trigger plants are so called because they have a unique biochemical mechanism that causes the column, which is made up of male and female organs fused, to shoot out from under the labellum, where it is held furled, in time to deposit pollen on its chosen pollinator. This is the style, which is male and female organs fused, and at one stage the style is fertile with male sperm, I guess, male pollen, and at the other time it's fertile as a female. Now what is interesting about the style is it's dead sticky. Yeah. So I think this is female, which makes sense, I suppose, because it's picking up the pollen off the back of the pollinator. Yeah. Now see this one here,
This one here is preparing to reload. Can you see that he's folding up?
Yeah.
Look at him, look at him.
Yeah.
Can you see him?
Yeah, the red bit.
Now look at this guy, he's moving too. See, he's moving too. Now what is extraordinary about these plants is they're almost alive. They respond to stimuli as direct as that. And they are, to my mind, staggeringly beautiful. These are 2 fertilised ovaries here. These 2 spent plants that have shed their ovaries, shed their eggs, their seeds. Now the other thing I want to show you is the extravagant beauty of the back of the petal, which is patterned like that. It's full of extras, the trigger plant, and they never cease to amaze me. See?
Each species of trigger plant is adapted to a particular insect pollinator, which is why we can find so many different species living in the same habitat. Attempts to group them by flower colour and similarities in the shape of pollen grains or seed capsules are thwarted by an extraordinary degree of variability within species. This is one case where genetic information will help us to determine the boundaries of speciation. This is the common butterfly trigger plant. This is the reed trigger plant. This is the yellow trigger plant. You can just see the very long columns that have just been triggered. The boomerang trigger is low-growing and mat-forming. This stylidium is commonly called milkmaids.
He's not fooled. I can't be feeling right. No, it doesn't want the fly. What can it want? It doesn't want the fly. Oh, he's just gone off. See, prong. There's his prong there. They're reloading. We have to find one that's fully coiled. Hang in. Oh, there's another bug down here, see? Little capsid buggy looky thing. Nope, what a very choosy gal, all dressed up for the party.
In fact, the pollinator of this species of stylidium is a large native bee. This climbing trigger plant carries its flower on the end of a beak. Book trigger plant, an ephemeral, filling a she-oak glade. These fabulous plants belong to the Dampiera family, named for the explorer who found Western Australia, William Dampier. Within yards of the farmer's heavy machinery and chemicals, you may find kangaroo paws. This is the commonest, Anigoxanthus humilis, actually called common cat's paw. This green one, Anigoxanthus mangliasii, tolerates a variety of conditions and has been successfully adapted for gardens. The shape of the kangaroo paw is adapted to be easily pollinated by birds. On the edge of its lip, you can see the style and the anthers. As the bird reaches for the nectar in the tube at the base, his head will bump them, and when he gets to the next bloom, the pollen will be transferred. This is a rarer kangaroo paw, Anigoxanthus rufus. It is growing particularly luxuriantly because 2 seasons ago, fire swept through the scrub on this headland near Hopeton, as you can see from the blackened branches of the Banksias. Fire is built into the life cycle of many Australian plants. Banksias and hakeas will not release their seeds until fire has forced them open. Wherever you can see blackened branches, you will find fabulous plants growing beneath. This spectacular queen trigger plant, for example. Amid the charred branches on this road verge, we found donkey orchids, Diurus hebelii in this case, a wonderful blue goodenia, and this pointing spider orchid, this rare grevillea, this coral vine, and of course more triggers. All these plants were identified by my sister and I in 1998. Within 10 years, some of them will already have disappeared, never to return. When the explorers arrived, all the rivers of Western Australia carried sweet water. In the year 2000, none of them do. This is Australia, the oldest landmass on planet Earth. And we're right in the middle of it. In what used to be called when I was a kid, the dead heart. Wrong, of course. No more dead than anywhere else. Certainly less dead than the centres of many of our burnt-out cities. When the first explorers came here, they assumed that this country had nobody in it, because they couldn't see them. And so they called it terra nullius, meaning wasteland, land that doesn't belong to anybody. And they claimed it for their respective monarchs, in the end, for the King of England. And the King of England could see no reason why he shouldn't claim it as his, and why he shouldn't send his army to defend it, and why he shouldn't fill it up with all kinds of rejects from his own country. Not just convicts, you understand, who were never very many of the total population, but also the people who were being kicked off their own land for various reasons, the Scots crofters and the Devon farmers and Lincolnshire potato growers and all kinds of people who didn't have too many choices. And they found themselves pushed into a country too far away to ever return from, 12,000 miles around the globe. And then they began to find out, of course, that the country was somebody's and that it was inhabited. And what made it more difficult to see the people was that the people weren't terribly interested in being seen. The Australian Aborigines have less vanity, possibly, than any other people on the earth. And as they consider themselves to be identical with the landscape, they never had any reason to stand up and say, "Oi, oi, I'm here, look at me." And they tended, in the beginning, to just disappear, to just melt away. People constantly write about the blacks melting back into the bush where they came from, padding away as silently as they came, as if they expected them to come, you know, with trumpeters and outriders. But
The Australian Aborigine is a warlike person in the sense that he has problems that he has to solve by force of arms, not unique among the nations of the earth, and that he never thought of doing that. But most of those quarrels involved the intricate structures of his own society, his and her own society. Women are fighters too in Aborigine society. And there must have been occasional spearings in the beginning. I won't bore you with the details, mainly because I don't have them. But the real problem came when the settlers decided that they had the right to introduce their own food animals. They didn't learn to eat the food that this country produces. They were convinced, in fact, that it didn't produce any. And it's pretty much like supposing, A, there's nobody here, and B, there's nothing to eat. Well, there was somebody here, and they were eating, and eating reasonably well in those days, I think. The white man assumed that this country would be good to run cattle, the country that we're looking at. But in order to run cattle on country like this, you have to run an extraordinary tiny ratio of beasts to land. This property that we're looking at runs 4,000 head on 300,000 acres. Utopia, which is the purpose of our trip here, is a neighbouring land. It's 18,000 kilometres, square kilometres. That lease was taken up in 1927. It took the pastoralists that long to get as far as Utopia. 18,000 kilometres. It's as big as a country in Africa. And they held that lease from 1927 to 1976. And that land at that time was lived on by the Alyawara and the Anmajara people. And you see, the problem for them was that they really couldn't go anywhere else, because without their land they didn't exist. Now, white Australians now understand that Aborigines' identity is their land. They understand it like that. They understand the statement, I am my country. But they don't really understand what it means. I can't say that I understand what it means either. All I can say is that I'm trying. But I think it works like this, that the country is the knowledge of how the country supports life and how the country provides you with the wherewithal to live. But you have to learn it. It's not programmed into you. Nowadays we don't even think that these things are programmed into swallows. We now know that swallows have to learn how to fly south. Well, Aborigines had to learn how to travel this country. The knowledge is about journeyings, when to go, where to go, how to go. Of course, the most important thing on the journey is the whereabouts of water. And so a lot of the law has to do with how you get water in various places, but also what fruits come into ripeness at what time, where you'll find a sugar bag, which is a kind of ant that swells up with sugar, where you'll find all kinds of grubs and seeds, grass seeds, a staple of the bread. And every child, boy or girl, has to learn their knowledge of their country. And this becomes the inside of their brain, as it were. This becomes who they are. If we are the sum of our memories, this is who Aborigine people become. They become this knowledge. And the most important thing in their lives is to pass that knowledge on. to the children who come after. When a person dies, the knowledge that is taken up by someone else is, as it were, their surviving personality, and it's as if they did not exist. People who are dead in Aborigine society don't exist. So it's quite extraordinary for us to demand that the Aborigines show proof of ownership, that they can prove title, they can prove heredity. They are it. The very fact that they know what they know and the way they know it is the evidence of the justice of their claim.
There used to be a lot more water before the cattle came. The cattle fouled what surface water there was, and the native people had to survive on the rock holes that the cattle couldn't get to. There are still plenty of goannas, big lizards with rich meat and plenty of fat, and under the round witchetty bushes there are plenty of grubs, and plenty of bush honey in the tree trunks, and bush plums and bush tomatoes in season, and grass seeds to make flat bread. Gathering such things is women's work. Men hunt kangaroo and emu. Kangaroo and emu are good eating, but you don't see many of them now. Since they had guns instead of spears, the Aborigines themselves have shot them out. Walking through this country, an Aborigine can read the rocks and the pebbles and the bushes and the grasses the way we read hoardings from a train. From childhood she has been taught the country and the paths that must be taken through it. This law she fixes in her mind by the ceremonial, sometimes called by white people the song lines. All over this huge continent there are sacred sites where men and women separately and sometimes together act out the due ceremonial that keeps everything in its place and time.
So what did the poor Anmajere and Aliwari people do when they were taken over by pastoralists? There was only one thing they could do. Well, the two things. They could commit suicide. They could commit mass suicide, or they could stay put, hoping that 400,000 years of of experience would stand them in good stead. Keep the knowledge, keep passing it on, keep their traditions. But of course, cattle are no respecters of water holes, amongst other things. And with the best will in the world, the Aborigines had found that they couldn't tolerate these hard-hoofed animals smashing up the water and turning the water into soaks, into mud, which the people couldn't drink. So they speared them, and then they were massacred in punishment, an exemple pour encourager les autres. And they massacred in their turn, but on a much tinier scale and with much less effective weapons. By the time the Aliwari people and the Anmajeri people found themselves taken over by pastoralists, the worst of these encounters was over, and the people realized that they had no choice but to capitulate to the cattle industry. They had to become cattlemen and their wives. They had to learn to muster and to brand, and they had to rely on the station owner for water, which he would get from a bore, and he could supply, and for basic supplies, because the cattle degrade the land and the traditional foods don't grow so well. And so they had to be fed with white man's tucker, which is, in those days, back in the 20s and 30s, was flour, sugar and tea. That's what they got. And so they became diabetic, malnourished, and they were also taught to drink. This is a people whose diet contains no sugar and no salt. It was a hypo-diabetic diet. And when they were introduced to refined sugar and to alcohol, they very quickly fell prey to a whole gaggle of diseases, including, of course, diabetes, which is a major health problem still for Aborigines, just as it is for other hunter-gatherer peoples in the world. In 1976, things began to change, and people realized that this was wrong, that it was wrong to have alienated the land from the Aborigines, who had no choice but to live on it, and to degrade it in the production of beef, and that the people should have a chance to buy back the land and nurture it, and reinstate their old ways of life. Now this was a double bind, because people were prepared to be generous to tribals. You go out there, we'll give you the bush back, you go out and live on it, and don't be any trouble to us anymore. No dole, no handouts, you go out there and be tribals. That's fine, you do that, that's good. We'll forget all about you. But of course that really couldn't happen either. In 1979, following the new laws about native title, and a new approach on the part of the federal government to native title, the Anmajera and Alwara people managed to acquire the lease. Interesting, they couldn't acquire the land because the land belongs to the King of England, or the Crown of England, in this case the Queen of England. They managed to get the leasehold on their 18,000 square kilometres. And then extraordinary things began to happen. The first thing and the most exciting thing in some ways was that the land recovered. The grasses grew long. Sacred grasses there are on Utopia land. The grasses grew long, the trees thickened up, the landscape became once more secret and not open so that people walking through it were exposed. It became once more the natural medium of the people. And then people started to look for other things to do. Not more cattle. They could have gone on running cattle on Utopia. Nowadays, I think there are 100 head on Utopia, and they all belong to one person, who was a head stockman of Utopia Station in the days when it was a station, and who still wants to have some cattle around him. He likes them. He's used to them, so he has them. But otherwise there are none. But what are the people going to do? Difficult to get them back to the hard job of walking the land looking for the tucker. Kids want Coca-Cola, you know how it is. And they began to express the knowledge, the country, in a new way. And it started off with batik for the women, you see. The interesting thing about Utopia is that the regeneration has come through the women. Now this isn't as unusual as you might think, because that's pretty much what happens in among American Indians as well, that it's the women who are guardians of the culture, because the hunter-gatherer men are so fragile and they can't deal with their changed circumstances. They haven't the adaptability of the women. And what is really extraordinary about what's happened in Utopia now is this flowering, not simply of a kind of traditional antiquarian art, but of something really vital, really personal, innovative. I don't want to say individual, because this is a bit of a moot point, but certainly a celebration of the land, which is the same thing as a celebration of the people. And this whole movement had its beginnings in the Northern Territory at another site, at a place called Papanya, and that was masterminded by a white man who only wanted to talk to men, only worked with men. But what happened in Utopia was that the women were introduced to the art of batik, which is kind of funny because Australia is the only continent on the planet that does not have any indigenous batik tradition. But the women took to batik like ducks to water and began producing work of such sophistication, such exuberance, such lyricism and elegance, that the world stopped and stared. They didn't really believe that inside the heads of these people whom they'd seen hanging around because there was nothing sensible for them to do, who they'd seen humiliated and they'd seen drunk. Inside these people were these amazing visions, these exotic forests, these extraordinary melodies, really, these bold strokes. It's not all like that, the work. Some of the work is full of grief.
In 1978, two craftswomen came to Utopia's store with the idea of teaching these highly creative women to dye batik. The women of Utopia had no interest in wearing these beautiful cloths themselves, but they enjoyed making them. After years of displacement and brutalization, these remarkable people began producing objects of such delight and consolation that they seemed to sing in exultation. The way they are while they are doing it is also wonderful. Their hands move with such sureness and delicacy that it's like dancing. Some of the experts in Aboriginal art say that this work is haptic, done not for the product, but for the pleasure of doing. Though Aborigines have no tradition of making portable paintings, they are all painters. Part of Awalye is painting the body with ceremonial designs. And the next thing that happened was, because batik is fabric, because it's associated with women, it has no great value. It doesn't have the prestige of a rigid artwork that goes in a gallery. It's a rag, it's a cloth. And so eventually, from various quarters, not from just one, the idea took hold, well, we'll start doing painting. It's quicker and it's less laborious. In acrylics, of course, dries quickly. It's a nice, easy medium. So you have this funny marriage of the medium with the moment, really. And just when the women really needed to create these expressions of their spiritual posture, their passion, their faith, there it was, the medium for doing it.
some cases we put on this first coat, sometimes we don't.
The women working here are all related to the great painter Emily Germaine Greer, who died in September 1996. Emily came here often to paint her vision of Awolye, herself, her country, and the history of her country as it exists in the dreaming. But all the time, the Aborigines were still Aborigines. They were still people who didn't have a cult of personality, who didn't exalt individuals over the kinship network, which is not to say they didn't have a hierarchical society. They do. But people only have value in Aborigine society as they relate to their kin group, their affines, their clan, their moieties. And it's in the observation of these relationships that people have reality. And so that's really partly what their work is about. Their work is about connections, about networks, lines, joining people. They're also journeys. They all interconnect this extraordinary image of a unified universe and their place in it. But then all the other contradictions come in. And one hardly knows sometimes whether to laugh or cry. Because for them, there was no point in signing the work. A name on the work meant nothing, especially if you weren't allowed to mention it after somebody died, which you're not. And the work itself, Aborigines are not interested in property. They love money, which is but money is a medium of exchange, and they've always been interested in that. But they're not interested in buying stuff, except cars, but that's to do with the journeying. They love cars, they love dogs, they love money. But as for all this business of painting going into a gallery, going into the National Gallery, that's funny. Because the important thing about the painting is not the finished product, but the painting of the painting. They're masters of art as process. And incapable of understanding what the fuss is about art as product. Yeah, it's finished. Finished. Now, what are you going to do with it? Well, we're going to stick it in a museum, which is another name for a graveyard of living art. middle of the winter of 97-8, the women of Utopia were uprooted from their country at the hottest time of the year and flung around the world to Paris at the coldest, darkest time of the year. I couldn't imagine how they'd be able to create their wonderful works under such conditions. I needn't have worried. The spirituality of Anmachera women is so strong that it could overcome far more terrible things than 2 weeks in a cold and unfamiliar city. They brought Central Australia with them. The same designs can also be seen in sand painting.
In the tree or in the ground?
The sand painting will only last until an animal runs across it or the wind blows it away.
Pull him out.
Once the singing and the painting are over, Lena and Gloria have no further interest in the product. And so there's this strange now confrontation between the art industry, white fella art industry, and black fella art activity. It's like expecting a silkworm to care what you make out of silk. Of course he doesn't. Neither knows nor cares. Which is not to say that Aborigines aren't sophisticated, they're very sophisticated. They just have decided, I think, or not even decided, they've always known that we were wrong. And we have to be wrong, if you think about it. The way we treat art, the way we single out works that are worth £40,000 against works that don't look very different to the naked eye that are worth £4 or dollars or drachma or yen. And strangely, none of the Aboriginal artists at Utopia is so driven that she has acquired her own canvases, her own colours. She can go into Alice Springs and buy them like anybody else. She prefers other people to do that. And to keep the canvases and the stretchers and all the rest of it. They can do all that donkey work. And when it's all ready, she'll come in out of the bush and sit down and paint the inside of her head until it's finished. And then she'll take her money. And it isn't true, you know, that she's being horribly exploited and, you know, she's getting sixpence and the work is being sold for millions. The politics of the community mean that she can't be paid much less than anybody else and other people can't be paid much more than she is. The stars have to support the non-stars and so on.
But it is quite extraordinary that she emerges like a spirit of the bush and sits down all day, leaning on one elbow, painting a pattern which the pleasure for her, I think, the achievement for her, is having the pattern materialize out of her mind, which she doesn't think of as being hers exclusively. And you see, the thing about this that is so consoling is that you would have said 50 years ago that this couldn't happen. But even though we were beginning to realise what a culture Aborigines had, we thought of it as we think of the dead heart, as finished, over with. No hope, gone, lost. And the extraordinary power of the women of Utopia, and the art of the women of Utopia, which is now known all over Australia and is now becoming known in the rest of the world, leads me to believe that we can learn from our mistakes and that we can recover, that this land can be retrieved, that it can become a special place, not a white colony, but an Aboriginal nation. I mean, it doesn't matter what colour we all are, it doesn't matter what genes we have.
Makaranje